Integrate Yourself podcast. We're your hosts, Allison and Maja. Today, we're speaking with Tressa Yellig of the Bone Broth Bar, or the Broth Bar in Portland, Oregon, and it's a dedicated bone broth cafe. And she does it in collaboration with her sister, Katie. The intention of the Broth Bar is to offer a positive and delicious experience of daily wellness in the form of traditional foods to everyone from busy professionals to athletes on the go and to those in need of healing nutritional support. It is a place for community and education, offering high-quality therapeutic bone broths with a variety of add-ons to your unique sense of what feels and tastes good. Thank you so much, Tressa, for being on the show. Tell us a little bit about what your journey was, what your inspiration, your influence was for creating this awesome business that I go to very frequently, almost every day.
That's awesome. I'm so glad you come. And thanks for having me on the podcast. Mostly the inspiration. I mean, I was gearing, let's go back. When I decided to go to cooking school, I had a very different opinion of food and what food was. And I was definitely one of those sort of glorified foodies that was just in love with elaborate preparations and seasonality and the idea of small farms. I mean, I feel like my original entree into this whole world really began with the slow food movement. And so I just felt like became incredibly romanced by the idea of the biographies of small farms, farmers all over the world preserving a unique way of making food. And it was in New York that I met Jessica Prentice, who started Three Stone Hearth in Berkeley. And she had written a book called Full Moon Feast. And when she was doing her book tour in New York, she did a fermentation class, and it just blew my mind. You know, being a culinary student, I had this idea that elevated food tastes, textures, or experiences were all pretty much relegated to human intervention. You know, that we were required, like this was an elevated science that we had developed through technology to create this style of eating. It blew my mind, literally blew my mind, that wasn't true at all. In fact, it was just the opposite, that nature in and of itself was the technology that was creating all of these food traditions in a much richer way. So the hands-off, less ego chef intervention was pretty transformative for me. So I just fell down this rabbit hole on fermentation and kind of stalked Jessica on her book tour until finally she said, well, hey, we're starting this new thing. We're calling it a community-supported kitchen, and we're only doing these kinds of traditional foods. So I basically skipped graduation because at this point I was like, oh, this whole world of food I've been in is not relevant to me anymore, and just pretty much went straight to California to learn everything I could about it. And it really was romantic. Despite the fact that I still worked in restaurants and, you know, really wanted to build up this perception of myself as a chef, you know, I had treated all of that style of cooking more as a hobby. And it wasn't until I got very, very ill that I fell back into it passionately, and then discovered, mostly by accident, which I know sounds really naive, that it played a huge role in my own healing journey, pretty much exclusively. And so that's when it occurred to me that this sort of resource didn't really exist beyond what Three Stone Hearth was trying to do. And, you know, there's a big bad world out there outside of Berkeley. and that the rest of the world really needed access to this style of food too. So it was in 2008 that I came out to try to find a place in the Pacific Northwest to create this concept. And then early 2009 when we actually opened Saltfire in Time. And it's taken a million different evolutions since then. You know, it started as a much larger prepared food service with changing weekly menus and weekly dinners with speakers that were doctors or food artisans or nutrition people. And what was interesting was that as much as I wanted to get into that community of, let's say, busy professionals that I thought would appreciate the convenience of, you know, healing foods that were seasonal and locally sourced and organic and all of that, what actually came to us were people that were desperately ill.
Uh,
And so it was interesting to watch how this massive shift sort of happened in the business, where what we began to really focus on was giving people the tools to really fuel their own healing journey, because that level of trust and transparency didn't really exist in mainstream food culture at that time. And I mean, it's hard now to imagine when pork belly was not a popular item on the menu, or when cultured vegetables were, speaking a different language, and from a regulatory standpoint, as much as in the popular opinion. So it's been an interesting trajectory over the last, almost 10 years, to watch how this moved and shifted into something that now is sort of on everyone's mind and part of the common conversation about preventative medicine, everyday lifestyle, kind of eating. And that's one of the things I feel like makes this so relevant today, is that when you look at peasant food traditions, they were functional medicine, but they were also lifestyle decisions, because they had to make decisions that were both healing, preventative, health supportive, frugal, but also accessible and delicious enough to make them every day. So it's really fun to see that conversation starting to share the stage with mainstream food, which is where we are now. When we opened the Broth Bar, and that was our big motivation with opening the Broth Bar, was to try to keep that conversation rolling and give people an experience in a very accessible way. So that happened in 2015.
Nice. Yeah, and I really appreciate it, because, I mean, the accessibility thing is incredible. Like, you can't go to any city and just go grab a cup of broth, like a cup of coffee, which I just love it. And like, especially if I'm feeling sick, or if I'm feeling like my immunity is a little down and I don't have time to make broth, it's great to have that. And then I know just recently you started adding things like chicken hearts and all kinds of really cool add-ons to the broth, which is amazing. And then I went the other day and you guys had fish broth. So I was like, wow, this is, every time I come, it's something new and different, and just incredibly, it tastes incredible too. So I really appreciate you being there, doing the work that you've done to get it out there, as well as making it accessible to everybody, because as we all know, bone broth is so important to health, and it is a food that has actually been taken out of the diet in recent years, and I'm glad it's being pulled back in, because it is a staple. It provides really great minerals, great digestive motility for the gut as well. So we really, really need it, and I don't think we realize how badly we need it in our diet. Not just for sick people, right? It's for everybody. Right. So, yeah. So I think I'd like to go down the road of like talking a little bit more about broth too, and about the medicinal qualities of broth and what you've learned about it since you've been on this journey.
Sure. I have to say, it's interesting, because I always tell people it's probably as complex as you're willing to let it be. Yeah. It can be the simplest and the most complicated medicine available. Yeah. It's in, what was her name? Kate Shanahan, Dr. Kate Shanahan, who wrote Deep Nutrition. When she talks about the 4 pillars of health, I love that she brings up bone broth in that book. And she says that, it's amazing, with 200 some odd years of medicine behind us, we still don't have the science to identify all the active components in broth. So it's hard, in a way, talking to people about this medicine. And I call it experiential medicine, because we don't have all the science to prove all of the medicinal components. But what we do have is a history of human relationship to broth. As long as there's been a history of humans, there's been a history of broth in humans, and we have that much history experientially to prove its efficacy in our health and the role it continues to play. And you're right to say, it used to be a lot more commonplace, but like so many things that get processed and commodified with industrial food culture, it sort of got relegated to the sidelines just because of the time that it takes to make. And time really is currency these days.
Yes, definitely.
So it's not complicated to make. It's not difficult to enjoy. It's easy for the body in any form to take on. But finding time to make it and time to source those ingredients is the piece that I think is prohibitive for so many people in rebuilding that relationship to making this an everyday decision in our health. So,
Yeah.
So what we always tell people is, we didn't invent this. We just do it really well. And we don't expect you to source from us exclusively, but when you need a hand, that's what we're here to provide. But also, it was kind of an experiment in seeing, could we make a product where we didn't compromise on the integrity of it and scale it and make it accessible? Because that trust dynamic between food producers and consumers has been completely challenged in the last several decades, and rightfully so. People are right to ask questions, but the concern is always, are they asking the right questions? And in looking for such a clean product, are they actually talking themselves out of access to quality food? Because there is so much suspicion around grocery and purchasing processed foods. And unfortunately, there's really no distinction between us making bone broth and that being a processed food put in a package on the shelf, and let's say Campbell's soup.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You're saying like as according to guidelines for producing it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow,
so when
that's
people
crazy.
talk about it, it's weird to sort of think we've talked about processed foods as being the enemy for so long, but for all intents and purposes, we offer a processed food as well.
Yeah. Well, processing isn't the enemy so much because we have been processing food for, I mean, you have to some extent to digest it, right?
Right.
For it to be digestible. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But I think much the way the conversation around fermentation started to change when people started talking about, oh, maybe there's some holes in organic certification and we need to ask more questions. And maybe culturing food is a way of adding nutrition to food that would otherwise be conventional or forgotten about. And when people are making bottom line decisions about price point and what they can afford, it was interesting the way the fermentation argument started to come into play and become more relevant, in that people were saying, wow, we can use fermentation to put value back into food that we would otherwise think was nutrient, let's say, deficient.
Right.
And what I think is so interesting about bone broth is that despite being able to identify all of the active components, one thing we can say that we know that it does is normalize stomach acid.
Absolutely.
So if it normalizes stomach acid, and that's the seat of beginning this whole string of pearls relative to digestion, then if you think of wanting to be a price conscious or quality conscious nutrient shopper, drinking bone broth is a way of maximizing the way that you will digest and get nutrients out of food. Because it doesn't matter how pure the ingredients you're sourcing, if you can't digest and absorb those nutrients, it's still a waste of money all the way through.
I highly agree with that. And we tell people that all the time.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah. You can spend all this money on food. But if you're not digesting it or assimilating it, then it's a waste, and that's what you need to work on first. And that's why I tell people, Maya and I always talk about, getting the digestive motility going first with bone broth, with raw carrots, those kinds of tools. Those are kind of like your tools for aiding that digestive motility, so you can actually start that fire going, and then you're able to actually absorb the nutrients. So. And those are the things that, if you're slow with digestion, that's what you want to look at first.
Right.
Yeah. So that you can, yeah. So, but unfortunately those kinds of things, like you said, are not in our food system so much anymore. And it's really it's really important for us to be able to bring those traditions back, because one thing that also Maya and I talk about a lot on our show is thyroid hormone. Like, this is something that's really missing in our diet, and that's why you're seeing all these hormonal imbalances, and people are really struggling because we have taken that out of our food. And bone broth kind of the gelatin in the bone broth can provide that, as well as high calcium levels, really good minerals, and that kind of thing too. So
I actually wanted to ask Tressa about how long she's been in the business of making the bone broth itself, and what she's seen that's changed over the years of doing it, and where she thinks the future of it's going.
Sure. Well, the company started in early 2009, and we've been making bone broth since the beginning. Although it's funny, in the beginning with the other foods, it definitely was kind of a sleeper, um, and we couldn't even give it away. But because people didn't really know how to engage it, obviously people think of broth as as a base of a soup or the base of a sauce, but just drinking it on its own was really hard for people to wrap their brains around. It wasn't until a lot of professional athletes like Kobe Bryant it was January of 2015 started talking about bone broth for muscle recovery that people started finding that courage to want to try it, give it another shot, and develop a separate relationship with it outside of including it in recipes. Because cooking is hard for a lot of folks. Cooking is this lost art. I mean, even just finding the patience of mind to sit down in your kitchen. We used to joke in the Occupy movement, time to occupy your kitchen, But part of that just means taking the initiative to try. And so this is a one-step ready and done kind of accessible food source for people. So bone broth, the way that I've seen it change since we began is really separating it from recipes to something that sits on its own, like a smoothie, like a finished food for people to access as a ready-made meal or snack, really. And also sourcing bones and the price of bones. I mean, one of the things that made it so easy to include at any price point in the beginning was that farmers were just desperate for a place to put this stuff. It was being composted or sold to meat markets to be smoked and given away to animals. And so we could just get cases and cases for pennies on the pound, which was wonderful. And then when the popularity went up, so did the price point. And that made bones a lot more competitive to source, which was hard because, again, the public perception is this is a waste product. This is a pantry staple. This should be very cheap. But when the price of bones is similar to the price of, let's say, steak, and then obviously the follow through on that, the price point to the consumer as a value added product goes up. It's been difficult to watch that perception of the value of it change for good and for bad. On one hand, the price point validates the efficacy, the purity, the importance, the nutrient density, and on the other hand, it makes people sometimes question, is it too precious? Is this a fad? But just like I said earlier about the experiential aspect of it, tragically, people aren't getting better. And we see this all the time in our shops, that bone broth for a lot of families, for a lot of bedbound people, for a lot of folks struggling on their own, is that linchpin in making the transition to feeling empowered to live their lives, giving them just enough relief from symptoms to start taking the next step in their healing journey or just in their life. And so that's why I honestly don't believe this is a fad. I think we'll see more of it. I think what we'll see is a lot more do-it-yourself kits, people trying to make it more accessible for time-crunched folks to make it home, for people that want to sort of shorten the steps in between. I don't think bone broth will go away, but I think similarly questions will begin to arise in consumers around quality, sourcing, processing, and what they're really willing to engage to make it part of their life. So when I see the future of bone broth, I see it on more menus. I see it, existing in people's homes. But I think the tricky thing is in what form and how it would change to be there, because you're starting to see Keurig cups that are called bone broth and freeze-dried bone broths and powdered bone broths and all versions of Tetra Pak bone broth and a lot more conversation happening around packaging and bone broth than the actual bone broth itself, which I want to try to take back. And that's a big part of what we do at Broth Bar and that I do as an educator is trying to encourage folks to just ask those questions and notice the differences, because like any food that gets more popular, there become a lot of different iterations that will take that name and call something let's say, of lower integrity, the same product. And my biggest fear in that is that bone broth will be blamed, or something called bone broth will be blamed for not having a significant enough therapeutic effect. When you and I know from experience, and experience is what will keep it in the market, that it does work, but it works when it's cleanly sourced. It works when it's traditionally made. You're not going to get that effect from animals that have been conventionally raised, or products that have been forced via pressure, or with added gelatin, or with lots of yeast or MSG or flavor additives. People aren't going to see that same healing effect, and they'll become equally suspicious, and that just breaks my heart. So, kind of letting bone broth, or at least our bone broth, try to hold space for bone broth in the future. And I think we do that by giving people more experiences. So the hope for us is to try to get into grocery and scale regionally instead of just one spot, so we can pull in collections of farmers that have practices we support and grow our operation so that we can protect those processes and explain to people the differences between what makes ours a therapeutic grade product versus any other product on the shelf that just has the name bone broth. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. It made me also think of another one, which I wanted to know. When you're talking about the beauty of seeing people who are sick that came to you to get this, I call it precious gold, because it's something that is, it does miracles for certain people in certain times of their life. But when I started making it, I learned a lot about the bones themselves and what is provided in certain things. So like when I first started, I did marrow bones, and a lot of things I got told was that as I learned how to really make it, like chicken feet and certain parts like oxtails are a little bit more gelatin providing. So like when you start to create your bone broths, like how to, if you do use marrow bones or anything, sometimes roasting them helps it. So there's these whole stages of change for different ways of getting it, but also there's a whole other level of people in different stages of their health, whereas they may do okay with marrow bones, but somebody who's not would do better with a more like gelatin packed one, because of the differences of the aminos based on the glycine, whether or not it has certain things. Like I also will point out that when I started working with gelatin in a powder, really we kind of recommend the one called Great Lakes, and it was a great one. Yeah, it's great, right? However, what I learned from my own experience was another thing. It caused some irritation in the gut if you're not prepared to take it slowly, or you don't have what it's able to break down. So what would you say is like some of the key points that you are providing with that kind of education? Like, since you're the cook, you may know a lot more than what I'm talking about, but
sure. No, those are all really good points. The one that I always say, or a good place to begin is, broth is something that can meet people any place they're at. And there's, a cooking perspective on broth, and then there's sort of a therapeutic aspect to broth. There's the gourmet perspective, and then there's sort of the cooking for health perspective, or the home perspective. And I can see all of this really overlapping a lot, because it is a culinary tradition, but it's also a peasant food tradition. So, I always tell people roasting is a flavor component. It's not going to release more nutrients. It's going to improve the flavor if you want a richness, but it's not a necessary component for releasing nutrients in the bones. So that step is sort of an optional one. Then in terms of sourcing bones, you're right to say marrow bones have traditionally always been considered the big soup bones, but they're also the most expensive bones, and they're just not in large supply. So, given those beautiful big back femurs are great because there's usually a little bit of meat, they've got the biggest amount of marrow, and they're a broad cut bone. But if what you're going for is gelatin content, then they're not going to be ideal for someone that wants to maximize gelatin intake. other parts, heads, tails, knuckles, any form of joint, ears, skin. I mean, those parts are going to be the best sources of gelatin. But I feel like we've made the mistake in bone broth of assuming that a gelatin set is proof of success in making it. And what I always tell people is you can always add more gelatin. It's the other parts that are harder to make up. So don't let gelatin set be an indicator of doneness. Keep that broth. I mean, for a variety of reasons, temperature, time, water, volume to bone ratio, you may or may not get the gelatin set you desire. But that doesn't mean it's not in there, and that doesn't mean that can't be adjusted. It's some of the other pieces that are harder to make up in terms of cofactors or mineral content and some of that. So there really is no such thing as failure in bone broth. It's just, what do we use as markers of a successful effort making it? And I think delicious is the marker most people should go for. Does it taste good to you? Does it smell good to you? I mean, we hear that a lot in the shop. My partner can't stand the way it makes the house smell, so that's why I buy it from you. I totally get it. It's like cilantro. You can divide a room on people that find that smell deeply comforting and, you know, nostalgic, and other people that find it absolute garbage. So, you know, my point being, the medicine works because it's delicious. It has to feel good in your body. So people shouldn't force themselves to drink something that they aren't naturally pulled to want. But gelatin, and you're right to say, too much of anything can create a problem, and especially in someone seriously gut compromised, like we see a lot of SIBO patients. And for them, in the beginning, the gelatin might just be too much because it does break down to a polysaccharide, so we know that it can feed certain kind of bacteria. But in that big umbrella of various bacteria in our gut, that's such a small number that will be affected by that. So there's a few things that come to mind. One being, don't let great be the enemy of good. Don't assume what your body can or can't handle until you've let it try for itself. And also, we consider our version of bone broth with a miscellaneous collection of bones to be a full strength, biggest powered medicine. But if the body is severely compromised, it has to build up. It needs smaller, weaker doses of medicine before it can handle, let's say, a full strength medicine like what we do. And that's where I think making a marrow bone exclusive broth that has more of the fat from the marrow and less gelatin may be exactly what someone needs in the beginning to build up that intestinal fortitude to handle more gelatin in their broth gently. Until they can really go into it sort of an everyday lifestyle with, let's say, a full-strength, heavy gelatin bone broth. Gelatin's not the enemy. It's just sometimes I think we assume that food is either very destructive or it has to be the perfect medicine. And there is no perfect medicine. It's just finding what the body can access at what time until it gets to where we want it to be. And we know that because we live in our bodies. So we have an experience of trial and error all the time, guided by wonderful humans like you that hold people's hands in this process, because I think for a lot of folks, it just begins as a dare to try something different and believe. And that's one of the things I love so much about this style of cooking is that it's immediate medicine. I call it like a nutritional first aid. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to feel the difference. You'll know right away if you feel better, if you feel relief, if you feel calm, if you feel sick, if you have some kind of reaction, you're going to know immediately because our body tells us right away if this is what it wants. And so I do think you're always going to get a better deal looking for some of those odder bits, and you will probably get a better bone broth, especially if you're willing to go outside of chicken and beef. And again, it's interesting that people might be pushed in that direction regardless with the number of allergies and things that are starting to come up around those two animals, due to hybridization or whatever. So for people, when you think of that sort of axiom about diversity being the key to survival, I really think the same is true in our guts to a certain degree. Having a diverse, and I know a lot of people get stuck in ruts of routine around food, and they have been scared of food for so long, so finding one thing that works, they don't want to vary, they don't want to push the envelope, just this is good enough for now, and that's great. But if price is an issue, or sourcing is an issue, or just, creating access is an issue, or just finding something delicious is an issue. There's a lot of different animal options out there that vary both in gelatin content, protein content, mineral content, and flavor. So fish is a great example. For our keto people that are looking for a little less protein but still want the gelatin, the fish broth is great. Plus, it takes a lot less time to make. And so for our like transitioning vegans and vegetarians that are just starting this, that feels a little bit more accessible. But I mean, everybody starts on the chicken, and then they go somewhere else.
Well, I guess I don't. I haven't really checked your menu, but do you have for vegetarians, basically a mineral broth that allows people to get the greatness out of really green vegetables is what you can do is take a wonderful soup out of it too, like do a broth for a mineral broth, because it gives you the K and the magnesium and all the things that the vegetables themselves, like kale, turnip greens, collard greens have, that really actually can help the calcium changes in their body. And so do you provide that also?
We don't have a vegetable broth, so to speak, on the menu. What we do have for people that's on the menu is a variety of misos and non-soy misos. We have fermented carrot and mushroom stir-ins and a mushroom powder that's made from maitake, shiitake, and cordyceps. And so we can create sort of a vegetable mushroom-based broth, so to speak, but we don't actually cook, much like Rebecca Katz's, magic mineral broth. We don't have something like that we cook for long periods of time with layers of vegetables in it. But from a flavor perspective, we can create something pretty nutrient dense in the shop for people that aren't quite ready to make the animal shift.
Okay. Sure, yeah. I get that. Okay. So one of the other things I wanted to ask was, what would you say to people who do want to create their own, and how, like, the debate has always been how long you cook the bones, where people are always like, well, this recipe says this, and then there's an issue about how long you cook and what exactly it's doing and how much it needs to break down. And so can you talk a little bit about that, little bit of controversy of what's, it's not, everything's nothing ideal, like you said. It's no perfect food, but what would you say would be some kind of starting point?
I think trying to go for at least 8 hours is usually in people's comfort zone. If you can go longer, I think you should. I think 24 hours at home is completely reasonable. Longer than that just gets hard. It really is just hard. I mean, part of the luxury that we enjoy is having separate kettles that stand alone, that aren't competing for real estate with other meals to just cook for days on end. But at home, that's hard. And so unless you've got an army of crock pots in your garage,
I was
going to
ask,
that.
Is it okay to do it in a crock pot as well, or?
I think crock pots are fine as long as you've done a little research on consumer testing with lead leaching on crock pots, and also just checking what the lowest setting is, because for a lot of folks, the lowest setting, or a lot of companies, I should say, the lowest setting on a crock pot is still a boil. So, and a boil, that temperature, you'll boil off your gelatin. So it really needs to stay under a boil. And so we say under a simmer. I call it a shiver. So under 200 degrees is ideal for basically as long as you're comfortable with. But I say at least 8 hours. And at home, at least. If you can go 24, that's dreamy. But then what I also tell people is, don't think of it as one and done. You can do multiple cooks on the same set of bones. I don't know that I would do 10 cooks on a bone, but let's say you did a 24-hour cook on a set of bones. That might be your sipping therapeutic broth. That's the one you drink on its own. And then do a second cook on your broth for like another 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, whatever you're comfortable with, and let that be your cooking stock. Let that be the thing that you put into recipes. I've heard a lot of anecdotal cooking stuff around, I do 10 cooks on a bone, I cook my bones until they're powder, all of that. I wouldn't do that. I mean, I can tell you there is a difference from watching it cook. There is a difference at 8 hours, 12 hours, 24, 36, 48, 72, and that's why we go 72. But we don't go longer than that. And so what I kind of encourage folks to think of is, if we know we can go up to 72, think of doing multiple cooks until you reach that on a set of bones if you want. I mean, that might require a little bit too much recycling for people. I've also heard people talk about their continuous cook broth, where they just keep adding bones to a crock pot and a little bit more water and topping it off and pulling from that. And again, I think that kind of comes into what your comfort level is on food safety and that. But I mean, if you're cool with it, it's delicious. But I would encourage people, go at least 8 hours if you can. And under a boil. And because you can't really rush it. That's the thing. It's just like any other form of protein. If you rush the heat, all of those proteins are going to tense up and take longer to get into solution. If you add gentle heat slowly over time, you will get a much denser product in solution, especially if you have the time and patience to add that little splash of acid at the beginning and let it sit for a minute, because that just begins to eat at the bone skin a little bit, just enough that by the time you add heat to activate that process, your result's going to be hugely different.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying 200 degrees, and don't bring it to a boil. Right? Okay.
If you can help it. But if it goes to boil, it's not murder. It really is. But just don't leave it at a boil.
Do you recommend adding like vegetables to the mix as well?
I do at the end.
Okay.
At the end, because one of the things I have to laugh at, and forgive me for laughing, I just, it's not intuitive for people that aren't cooks.
Yeah.
That overcooked vegetables get bitter. So I'll hear people come in and say, my bone broth was bitter. And I keep thinking that's impossible. Bones aren't bitter. But overcooked vegetables are. So if you do want to add vegetables, add them in the last 30 minutes to an hour of your cook time and take them out. And that's a way of layering flavor too. I actually think that recipe for the magic mineral broth in Rebecca Katz's book is amazing and wonderful supplement if you really want to bulk up the mineral count in your broth. So throwing in, let's say, carrots, onions, celery for 30 minutes, then take them out, then throw in sweet potatoes, garlic, some other things, and pull them out. That kind of thing, doing gradual cooks. So you get the sweetness and the minerals from your vegetables without risking the bitterness of overcooking them.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. And even the herbs, I would say, the herbs too.
Same.
And the salt too. Do you add salt to it as well?
I usually don't. Like all of our broths are unseasoned. And if you're going to add salt, add it right at the end. Only so that in the event that you do choose to cook with it or you want to stir something in, you don't run the risk of over-seasoning.
What would you say is the key point to peasant food? Like what is like the main, besides just being helpful to the person in their digestion and stuff, but do you understand what I'm asking?
I think so. When I think of so peasant food or provincial food traditions can be just as beautiful, but usually they're not designed around a single serving. I think it's family style cooking, the idea of cooking at scale, cooking in community. Now we hear people use words like batch cooking. We're all very visual creatures and we eat with our eyes first, and sort of the delight of seeing a beautiful plate and a variety of textures is so alluring. I wouldn't take that from people, but I also think sometimes we need to treat it, sorry, my kitty, treat it like a form of entertainment rather than a form of nourishment. And, eating out, the luxury of eating out. And in doing that, we open the door to a lot of digestive upset because you lose control around the way something's being prepared or what it's being prepared with. And bone broth is a way of making up the difference on some of that too, smoothing the rough edges, so to speak. But in terms of peasant food traditions, one of the things I love about them is just, again, that nostalgic beauty of the comfort aspect to them, the idea that they're intended to be shared and simple. People assume that food has to be, because this is the culture we're in now, the takeout culture of food, that food needs to be elaborately garnished or beautifully plated or assembled with a variety of colors and textures. You can do that at home, but falling in love with the ingredients individually, I think, is the romance of peasant foods, because what they're really trying to say is, how do we combine what we have in a meaningful way for the body that is also delicious? So, it's food thrift, but it's also assembling rather than creating every time. Um, and and again, thinking of something as a dish that you will serve. I guess I don't know if I really want to say that actually. I mean, when I think of peasant foods, I never think of someone eating alone. And when I think of peasant food traditions, I think of multiple portioned recipes. And when you think of elevated cuisine, it's usually around the experience of one plate and one person at a time. So it's just a different perspective around function. And when people are cooking for themselves at home, there's a sense of satisfaction around what's being completed and functionality around why you're doing it at all, as opposed to being engaged at a restaurant, experiencing a service and the graciousness of an environment and aesthetic. We eat with so many of our other senses too. And you can create that at home a little bit more simplistically, I think, but that shouldn't be prohibitive to trying. And that's why I say the difference between elevated cuisine and peasant food traditions is a lot of ego. It's also around, am I providing you with an experience as opposed to taking in something deeply nourishing?
Seems for me like peasant food is something that's always around, that is always going to be something you will keep because you like that flavor or taste or whatever. And then, like you said, bring the family component in. So I like that a lot.
Well, and one other thing I would add to that is I think sometimes people get a little overstimulated going out to eat in their food. And I think keep it simple.
Especially in Portland.
Yes.
All the restaurants we have here. Jesus.
You should be able to taste every ingredient in your food. It's there. And if you can't, if there's too many competing flavors on a plate, well, that's really overstimulating, not only for your brain, but for your body.
Yeah. So, yeah. When I've coached people on this kind of thing, because I experience, I have cooked for my family every night. And so for a person who's cooking for a family, it's really hard to create something new every night. Like we have like these set meals, talk to people, just set your menu up for the week and then have one night or 2 night tops where you try something different. You try to cook something different, but don't try it every night because that can just, drive you into the overwhelm stage. So I mean, we have our like set menu of what's easy to make and quick, and I know it's healthy, and I know the things that go into it. Like I'll put extra things like gelatin or broth in it to make it more nutrient dense. But yeah, I think and of course making a lot of food for people. You want something that's simple but also nourishing, like you said. So that's great. I like that. Yeah.
Well, beautiful quality ingredients are fun. I mean, I always feel like you need more processing, you need more preparation if the ingredients you're using aren't that magical on their own. If you've got a few showstoppers, that's all that needs to be on the plate. It could be
simple too, right? And it just could be just seasonal vegetables or something too to add into it. But I'm a big fan of cooking seasonally as well because I think it's really good that's a great way to rotate your food as well.
Another thing that is one of the things we talk a lot about is PUFAs, which are polyunsaturated fats that are in the oils of like, the seed oils and stuff that kind of are really used in a lot of restaurants. And a lot of things have been, showing up that if you're really trying to pay attention to how many you're taking in, that's one of the limiting factors is to stop going out as much because you can't control the oils that they use so much because of whatever we're being programmed against saturated fats, coconut oil being bad or anything like that, or pure butter is, still the evil that most people, have to come to terms with that it isn't. But that's another show. But I just find that's one of the limiting factors too, is that if the more you go out, the more your exposure is. So.
Absolutely. And restaurants really have their backs up against a wall. They want to splurge on one ingredient. And if they need to put the money into that ingredient, they're not going to put the money into a cooking oil. And with where they're sourcing, they don't make bulk options for healthy cooking oils. So that even though you and I know that is an essential part of what's going on behind the scenes, from a restaurant perspective, it's just a functional element in the preparation. It's part of creating that effect, not necessarily part of, working multidimensionally to make something healing or healthy or digestible even. Yeah. They're not thinking about the end. So it's kind of that front of the house, back of the house, right? If you think of your body as having a front of the house, back of the house, we're putting a little bit more emphasis on the back of the house and a little wave to the front of the house because we want it to be delicious and beautiful too. But all of their focus is really on the front of the house experience.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's a good for people to know that cooks and restaurateurs are just, they're in a bind, like the farmers are in a bind. There's certain things that need to be spread open more and more, and until that happens, it's hard for the restaurants to have full understanding of, hey, I can't provide this to you because it's really costly. It's it's something that will have to change time, but as we support your restaurant and keep kind of sending out more information about why it's not so good to use a lot of those oils, then we can kind of help people maybe change the status quo right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it is way more cost effective for most restaurants to have the crappy veggie oils instead of like coconut oil or palm oil. And even like palm oil now is coming into, like, if people don't want to buy palm oil now because of all that's going on with that whole thing. But yeah, I mean, it can be one of the most important components for health, actually, and I wish more people knew about that. Yeah, you're right, though, Tressa. It's not a major like concern for most restaurants. I think they're more concerned about the actual ingredients, the food, instead of like what they're cooking with. And actually, honestly, if they could just go back to cooking with butter, I'd be happy with that.
Butter's pricey too. I would love that, but yeah, it's tricky. I think for so many people, this all comes down to bottom line decisions, and so knowing that, taking that into account, yeah, of course you want to support restaurants that don't cut those corners, but you're also going to pay a premium for it too, and they need a lot of support.
Yeah, yeah, they do. What is something that our listeners might not know about bone broth that would be really helpful, or that you tell people that, and they're like, whoa, I didn't know that? Like,
probably that it's actually really low in minerals.
Oh, really?
Really?
I did not know that.
Well, this is what I think is so interesting. Minerals are present. If you guys check out our website and look at our nutrition panels that we've had them all tested, and we just redid our testing. Hopefully we've gotten the new results up there. What's interesting is that the mineral values in their blood go up drinking bone broth. But if you look at bone broth itself, the mineral values are actually really low, with the exception of vitamin B12. That's the only one that goes over the RDA. Calcium is especially low. But what I think is actually the magic is, again, going back to that normalizing stomach acid factor. I just think it means we're actually able to get more of that mineral value out of the food that we're eating in a way that's meaningful to boosting those blood mineral values, as opposed to expecting that we're digesting optimally all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there are minerals present, and it is a great source of minerals, but it's not enough. However, drinking bone broth will improve, let's say for anemics, improve drinking bone broth, even though the iron levels are very, very low.
Well, that makes sense, 'cause if it has high B12, you said, in it. Yeah, so that would help your body assimilate the calcium, or if you already have calcium that needs to be, assimilated in the body. But yeah, I didn't know that. I always was under the impression that it had high levels of calcium in it. So that's interesting. Yeah. But that makes sense. I mean, I guess it just helps your body do its job better.
It does. That's my point. Your body is the mechanism, and this is just supporting the machine. So yeah, keep you well lubed.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah.
And a lot of people drink it with meat to kind of help the tryptophan from meat,
Oh, right.
muscle meat being a really powerful thing that when you digest. So gelatins or bone broths are supposed to help that digestibility and not keep that and help keep down the tryptophan. Do you find that's also something that you tell people to help, or
You mean adding meat to their broth?
well, not. I mean, just using broth as another, not just only by itself, but you can use it with a meal to help that meal digestion.
Aiding the digestion of the meat, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, there are still Nordstroms that will serve a cup of broth before a meal at the Nordstroms that have restaurants in this country, and that's a very traditional way to drink broth, is to have a couple ounces before a meal. One of the things we always tell people is that there are, again, very limited studies that talk about what exactly would be a therapeutic dose of gelatin in a day. And most of them seem to average about 1.5 ounces of gelatin in a day. And in an 8-ounce cup of our broth, we average about 2 ounces of gelatin. So I think, in a culture of more is better, sometimes more is just more. When you think of, if 8 ounces is a therapeutic dose for a day, if I just had a couple ounces before a meal or with a meal, absolutely you're doing something magnificent and at a therapeutic level for your digestive system. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Well, Maja, do you have any other questions for Tressa?
I don't know. It's so well packed full of good stuff.
I know. It's like, really, this is a great show.
I know that, are you able to ship it to people, or are you limited only in Portland right now? Do you have, what's your kind of process right now?
We have, you can order online, and we ship all over the country. We've experimented with shipping out of the country, but not very well. Yeah. You can order online. We actually just instituted flat rate shipping, which is kind of revolutionary for us because the shipping was really prohibitive. We can't offer free shipping, tragically. Yeah. But being able to send it flat rate makes a big difference, especially for people on the East Coast, because it is perishable and it has to go quickly and it has to stay frozen and it is heavy. So that's kind of cool. You can order through our website. We also have a subscription discount for people that want to set up regular deliveries. You get about 10% off. But yeah, we have the 2 broth bars, one in Portland and one in Olympia. And then and we are just starting to get into some groceries in the Pacific Northwest. California will be next, but you have to look for us in the frozen section. That's the only trick. So
right, because it's fresh. It's real broth. Yeah.
Awesome. That's awesome. So we'll look out for you in the East Coast more when you start coming down this way and in grocery stores down here. But
absolutely.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Well, Tressa, tell us a little bit more about where everybody can find you. What you want to just tell everybody your website or the best way to contact you, or if you wanted to order online, etc.
Yeah, if you go to the website, it's saltfireandtime.com, and that's AND spelled out TIME.com. The website's the best way to access all of the product. If you have questions, you can email me at tressa@saltfireandtime.com, and I'm always happy to troubleshoot people's questions as they're making this at home or success stories. I mean, we're always excited to collect testimonials about, how this is affecting people's lives. That's one of the best parts of this job, is that we get a lot of grateful customers that are really happy to share their stories, and that's fun for us then to share as moments of encouragement for other people that are just asking whether or not they're ready to dip in a toe. As we start to get more folks on athletic journeys or caretakers or folks that are just trying to, affect their aging a little bit, people that want to slow or extend longevity. It's amazing how many ways that bone broth can affect people, and you don't have to just be a sick person.
No, exactly.
Right.
I always recommend my clients stop by your place on their way home or
Thank you.
after, if they're feeling like their immunity's low, especially, but just any time, because it's so convenient and just nice to have like a warm cup of broth in the middle of the day. It's just so awesome. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, lady.
Yeah. So
nice to meet you, and I'll have to try that broth soon.
Please do.
So thank you, Tressa, for coming on, and we'll see you soon. I know I'll see you at the Broth Bar soon. So.
Oh, you will.
Yeah. Thanks again for doing what you do. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
Right. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you saw today, definitely subscribe, give us a like, and share with your friends. Head on over to pureenergypdx.com if you want to comment and share your thoughts about today's show. And be sure to connect with Maja at majagottlieb.com, and you can find us on Instagram at pureenergypdx and Maja at majagottlieb. Be sure to go to patreon.com/integrate yourself if you want to support us and integrate into our online community today.